Hola, clase. Today, I'm going to teach you one more way that we can use reflexive verbs. So we've already learned how to use reflexive verbs to talk about actions that we do to ourselves, and we've learned how to use them to talk about actions that we do to each other, so that we do reciprocally. Today, we're going to learn something new. So we can also use reflexive verbs with the pronoun say to avoid specifying who the person is that's doing the action of the verb. So we give it this name, impersonal say, because when we use this formation in our sentences, we're kind of avoiding who the subject is of our sentence. We're kind of being vague on purpose or general. And we're going to do that by always using the pronoun say. So for the impersonal say, you're not going to use may, you're not going to use te, and you're not going to use nos. You'll only ever use say. This is actually really useful in the real world, and we do it all the time in English. We just don't use the pronoun say. We don't use the pronoun at all with the verb when we do it in English. So I'm going to show you some examples in English and Spanish of why we would even want to be able to talk about an action and not be very specific about who this subject is. So let's look at some examples. All right, so here's my first example. I've got this sign here that says apartment for rent. And if you read that, you'll know that this sign is telling us that someone is renting this apartment, but it doesn't specify who. You'll notice that it doesn't have the name of a person. It doesn't even say like a company or anybody that owns it. It just says apartment for rent. So we know the apartment's being rented, but we don't know by who. This is an example of an impersonal expression. We don't need to know who's renting it. That's not really important. So we focus more on the verb or the actions of what's going on here, and we kind of purposefully leave out who the subject is. All right, so here we have the same sign, but in Spanish. So, se alquila apartamento. So, apartment for rent. And you'll notice that we do use the reflexive pronoun se, and then we conjugate our verb in the LA form in this situation. I'll explain how you know what form to conjugate it in because it doesn't actually match your subject. But this is how you would express that same idea of apartment for rent that focuses more on the verb. And so we just put say in front of it as our reflexive pronoun because the person that's renting this apartment is not really the focus of this sign. And so it's not important. All right, in this example, we can see a sign that tells us that someone is selling a car, but again, it doesn't tell us who it is that's selling the car. And it doesn't tell us that because it's not important for us to identify who it is, right? All you really need to know is that there is a car for sale. So let's see how we would say this in Spanish. So in Spanish to say car for sale, we say se vende. So when I was in Honduras and I'd be driving around or riding in the bus or walking, you would see signs just like we see for sale all over the place. You see this phrase all over the place, in Latin American speaking countries. So se vende, for sale is what that means. So se vende carro, so car for sale. Again, we just use that say, we conjugate our verb. In this case, it's in the present tense and we're doing it in the LA usted form. Again, I'll explain that. But again, if I tell you who's selling the car, it's not actually going to change your mind or make any difference on whether you buy it or not. And so we don't need to specify our subject. And so we, instead of just putting the verb there all by itself, though, we do put the reflexive pronoun there. So that we kind of have a subject for our sentence. But since that subject's not important or anything like that, then it becomes an impersonal expression with this say there. You might have actually seen both of these signs before. Obviously, English spoken here, you probably haven't seen here in America because nobody's going to really put that on any buildings here. But in Honduras, or if you've ever traveled like to Cancun or somewhere like that, then you might have seen a sign that said English spoken here. And then se habla español, Spanish is spoken here. And again, when you look at these signs, the point is that English is spoken in that place, or Spanish is spoken in that place, but we don't know who the person will be that will be speaking English or be speaking Spanish. We just know in general that someone in that building is going to be able to speak to us. It doesn't say the name of a person because, if it's a gas station and it says English spoken here, whoever's behind the counter is going to be able to speak English, but, it's going to switch people all the time. So just a general statement. The focus is less on who it is doing it and more just on the service that's being provided by the business for us. So it's more focused on the action. Computers repaired here. Here's a sign again that focused on the action. It doesn't mention the subject, but of course we know that someone repairs computers in the place wherever this sign would be hanging. So here's a similar example using cell phones. So se reparan celulares aquí, cell phones repaired here. Again, the focus is on the action, not the person doing the repairing. And so in Spanish, we use the pronoun se, and then we conjugate the verb. This time you will notice that instead of conjugating the verb in the ella form, which is what we've pretty much been doing all this time, we conjugated it in the eos es form. And if you look at celulares right here, that should give you your clue. That's plural. So these verbs kind of function like the verb gustar, and we're going to look at those rules here after this. Here's just a few more examples of when you might see some of these common impersonal expressions just like used in real life situations. So you need to have fresh fruit to make fruit salad. These are kind of statements that we make. We're not necessarily saying that, a person's going to make fruit salad or telling you to get fruit salad. It could just be almost like a statement like, oh, in order to make salad, fruit salad, you need fresh fruit. So when you say you, it's not a specific you, it's just a general person. So in Spanish, we would use this se to give this idea of a general person. One should avoid unhealthy food. So it's just kind of talking about everyone in general. They serve wine by the glass. If you're talking about a restaurant or a winery and you say they serve wine by the glass, you're just talking about that place in general. Spanish food is served here. So there's another sentence that avoids the subject or the person who's doing the serving. Hiring now, you might see that on a business. So someone's doing the hiring, but it doesn't specify who. So all of these are examples of impersonal expressions. We see it like in recipes. Recipes use impersonal expressions. Directions, if you buy something new and you're reading the directions are all going to be impersonal expressions. They're not going to have a subject because there could be there's going to be tons of different people reading those directions. And so it's not like they're going to put your name on them, right? All right, so now let's take a look at the grammar. Reflexive verbs used with the impersonal se are really easy because you're always going to conjugate the verb in the third person, which means that you're either going to be conjugating the verb in the ella form or in the ellos, ellas, ustedes form, all right? And so there's a couple rules here, and you're going to see that these rules are really similar to how we conjugate the verb gustar, because as you know, we always conjugate the verb gustar in the ella form or in the ellos, ellas form. So we always conjugate it as gusta or gustan. And we always look at what comes after the verb, not what comes before the verb, which makes sense because se is always going to come before the verb with these impersonal expressions. So we have to look at what comes after the verb to figure out how to conjugate our verb. And so the first rule is the verb is in the ella form if it is followed by a singular noun. So these first three examples that I have here for you, if you look at the nouns there, fruta, comida, aspiradora. So those three nouns are all singular, which is exactly why then we conjugate our verb vender, so vende, prepara, and apaga. Those three verbs get conjugated in the ella form. And then, of course, our reflexive pronoun just goes in front of it, and it's always going to be se. The second rule is that when the verb is in the eos form, the verb is in the eos form if it is followed by a plural noun. So we've got hamburguesas, manzanas, and testigos. So the verb is going to be conjugated in the eos form, which is actually a typo here. I'll show you. So comen, necesitan, and then buscan, that actually needs an in on the end. Say buscan, because it's searching for the witnesses of the crime. It's this sentence, se busca a los testigos del crimen. They are looking for the witnesses of the crime. And again, really, we're not really sure, the authorities, the police, the judge, it's the victim's family. It's just a non-specific they here. So we just use se busca. They're looking for the witnesses. And then the last rule here, the verb is in the ella form if it is followed by an action. So this is just like the verb gustar. If it's singular, if the noun is singular that comes after the verb, then you're going to use the ella form. And if there is an action that comes after the reflexive verb, then you're also going to use the ella form. So in these sentences, you've got comprar, which is to buy, cortar, which is to cut, and trabajar, which is to work. And so since there's an action that's coming after the reflexive verb, necesita is going to be conjugated in the ella form, puede is ella form, and debe is the ella form, and then we just put that reflexive se in the front of each one. So some of these sentences, se necesita comprar naranjas y mangos. So they need to buy oranges and mangoes, not really specific on who needs to do that. Se puede cortar los vegetales primero. So one can cut the vegetables first. Is not really saying who. Se debe trabajar mucho para tener éxito. This one would be saying one must work hard to gain success. Again, not really specifying who the subject is. So these are some of the examples of the personal expressions. The activity that we'll be doing in class is making our own signs to hang up that use these reflexive verbs and with the impersonal say.